The courtroom buzzed with hushed conversation, the air thick with tension. The wood-paneled walls, polished brass fixtures, and heavy oak benches gave the place an air of authority, of finality. This wasn't a tabloid spectacle or a corporate lawsuit where money settled everything. This was about respect. At the defendant's table, Ethan Caldwell lounged in his chair, arms folded, a lazy smirk curling at the corner of his mouth. He was a picture of privilege, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than most people's yearly salaries. His designer watch gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a subtle reminder to everyone in the room that he had never known struggle, never known what it was like to be told no. To his right sat his father's high-powered legal team, each of them wearing the kind of sleek, expressionless professionalism that came with an endless bank account. Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now, back to the story. Across from him, at the plaintiff's table, sat Sergeant Thomas "Tom" Kane, a man who had earned his place in this world the hard way. Tom sat with his back straight, his hands folded in front of him, his weathered fingers scarred from decades of service. He didn't have a team of attorneys, just one dedicated lawyer and the truth. And the truth was, he had been wronged. The courtroom doors opened, and the bailiff called out in a firm voice, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Linda Mathers." The judge entered, her presence alone commanding respect. She was sharp-eyed, no nonsense, the kind of judge who had seen every trick in the book and wasn't impressed by wealth or privilege. As everyone took their seats, Judge Mathers adjusted her glasses and addressed the room. "We are here today to hear the case of Sergeant Thomas Kane versus Ethan Caldwell. Mr. Caldwell is accused of negligence resulting in injury, and today's proceedings will determine damages." Ethan rolled his eyes, barely hiding his boredom. Tom didn't flinch. The judge turned to the prosecution. "Counselor, you may proceed." Tom's attorney, Daniel Mercer, stood and adjusted his tie. He was young but competent, and more importantly, he believed in this case. "Your Honor, my client, Sergeant Kane, is a decorated war veteran. He has spent his life serving his country, protecting the freedoms we all enjoy. The defendant, Mr. Caldwell, through reckless actions, has caused my client severe injury and financial hardship. We are here today to ensure that justice is served." Ethan let out a mocking laugh, leaning over to whisper to one of his lawyers. The judge's sharp gaze flicked toward him. "Something funny, Mr. Caldwell?" Ethan shrugged. "Just seems a little dramatic, that's all." Tom finally looked at him. Not with anger, not with hatred, just steady, unshaken silence. Mercer continued, "Your Honor, the evidence will show that Ethan Caldwell, while driving his father's luxury sports car at reckless speeds through a parking lot, struck my client, an elderly veteran walking with a cane. Instead of stopping immediately to assist, he mocked my client, accusing him of being too slow before speeding off. It was only after bystanders called emergency services that Sergeant Kane received the care he needed." The judge's expression darkened. She turned to Ethan's lead attorney. "Mr. Caldwell's defense?" One of Ethan's lawyers, a sleek man named Harris, stood. His smile was thin, calculated. "Your Honor, while we acknowledge the unfortunate incident, we contend that my client was not acting maliciously. Furthermore, we believe Mr. Kane is exaggerating his injuries and is using this as an opportunity to extract financial compensation." Ethan grinned, leaning forward in his chair. "Exactly. I mean, come on, the guy's old. Maybe he should have moved faster." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Judge Mathers set down her gavel with a thunderous crack. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice low and dangerous, "I highly suggest you keep your mouth shut for the remainder of these proceedings." Ethan smirked but leaned back, folding his arms. Rachel, sitting in the gallery, gritted her teeth. She had been there that day. She had seen the look on Tom's face when Ethan had laughed in his face after hitting him. And now, this kid still thought it was a joke. Tom didn't show any emotion. He simply sat there, watching, waiting. Judge Mathers let out a slow breath. "Continue." Mercer stood. "We have eyewitness testimony and security footage from the parking lot showing Mr. Caldwell's actions." Harris waved a hand dismissively. "We have counter-evidence to suggest the footage is inconclusive." The judge rubbed her temple. "We'll review it shortly." In the meantime, Sergeant Kane, I'd like to hear from you directly." Tom nodded, standing slowly, his movements deliberate. He had stood in front of higher-ranking officers, in war zones, in courts of law, in rooms where men's lives hung in the balance. A spoiled billionaire's son? He wasn't intimidated. Tom cleared his throat, his voice steady. "I've served this country for 30 years. I've fought in places most people can't even find on a map. I've seen good men die, bad men win, and everything in between. But you know what I've never seen?" He turned his gaze on Ethan, locking onto him like a rifle scope. "I've never seen a man be so damn proud of being nothing." Ethan's smirk wavered. Tom stepped forward. "I didn't come here looking for a payday. I didn't come here for pity. I came here because this kid thinks the world owes him something, and I want him to learn one damn lesson before his father's money saves him again." Ethan clenched his jaw, but he didn't speak. Judge Mathers nodded. "I've heard enough." She picked up her gavel. "This court will take a brief recess before I deliver my ruling." She slammed the gavel down, signaling the break. As the courtroom began to empty, Rachel walked over to Tom, squeezing his shoulder. "You were right," she murmured. "He's nothing." Tom exhaled. "Not yet, but let's see what the judge has to say." He glanced toward Ethan, who was now pale, sweating, gripping the armrests of his chair like he finally realized this wasn't going the way he had expected. For the first time since the trial began, he wasn't laughing anymore. The courtroom doors swung open as the judge stepped into her chambers, leaving behind a room thick with tension. The moment she left, the buzzing murmurs of the gallery erupted. Journalists scribbled furiously in their notepads, a few already whispering to their editors, their heads bent over their phones. The story of a billionaire's son mocking a war veteran in open court was going to make headlines. Ethan Caldwell leaned back in his chair, rolling his shoulders as if trying to shake off the weight of the judge's glare. His smirk was gone now, replaced with the faintest twitch of frustration. His father's lawyers huddled around him, whispering in hushed voices, trying to salvage whatever dignity he had left. Across the room, Sergeant Tom Kane sat quietly, his hands folded in front of him. He wasn't whispering, he wasn't strategizing. He was simply waiting. Ethan glanced across the aisle, his jaw tightening as he met Tom's steady gaze. "Old bastard thinks he's gonna win this," he muttered under his breath. His father's lead attorney, Harris, sighed as he adjusted his tie. "Ethan, I strongly suggest you keep your mouth shut from here on out." Ethan scoffed, leaning forward, voice low. "I don't get it. It's an accident. We could have paid this guy off months ago, and he still wants to drag this out? What's his deal?" Harris exhaled sharply. "His deal is that you ran over a war veteran in a parking lot, laughed in his face, and called him a crippled relic while speeding off in a car that costs more than most people make in a lifetime." Ethan rolled his eyes. "So what? He's still standing, isn't he?" From across the courtroom, Tom shifted in his seat, watching him. Ethan felt that stare like a blade. It wasn't angry, it was worse. It was disappointed. Ethan looked away first. Tom hadn't planned on speaking again, but something inside him stirred. He adjusted his posture, leaning slightly forward, his voice carrying just enough to cut through the room. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his tone even. Ethan turned back to him, his brows furrowing. "Excuse me?" Tom rested his hands on the table, exhaling through his nose before speaking again. "You think this is about money, about getting a check and walking away?" His eyes locked onto Ethan's, unflinching. "That's your world, kid. That's not mine." The room quieted, people turning, drawn in by the weight in his voice. "I've buried men younger than you," Tom said, his voice heavy with experience. "Men who died standing for something. Men who fought for people they'd never meet, who bled so that some spoiled kid could sit in a courtroom and joke about a man they don't understand." Ethan tensed, his lips parting slightly, but no words came out. Tom continued, his voice unwavering. "This isn't about a payout, and it never was. It's about consequences. Because one day, your father won't be there to clean up your mess. Your name won't be enough to save you, and when that day comes, you'll realize that the only thing that actually matters is the kind of man you choose to be." The words hung in the air, the silence so thick it felt like the room itself had stopped breathing. Ethan clenched his fists beneath the table, his nails digging into his palms. His father had always told him that money fixed everything. But in this moment, with every pair of eyes in the room watching him, judging him, he realized it wasn't fixing this. The door behind the bench swung open, and Judge Mathers stepped back into the courtroom. The gallery immediately fell into a tense, expectant silence. Ethan swallowed hard. The judge adjusted her glasses and sat down, her expression unreadable. The court will now reconvene. I have reviewed the evidence and considered the arguments from both sides. She turned her eyes toward Ethan, and for the first time that day he felt small. Her voice was calm but absolute. And I have reached a decision. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The verdict was coming. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. The courtroom felt smaller now, the air thicker, charged with something that made even the most seasoned lawyers in the room sit up straighter. Judge Linda Mathers adjusted her glasses, her sharp eyes scanning the room with the kind of authority that made people forget how to breathe. Ethan Caldwell fidgeted in his seat. The smirk he had worn so confidently earlier was long gone, replaced by something much more unfamiliar: uncertainty. His father's lawyers sat beside him, silent, waiting. They were used to winning, used to controlling the game. But something about the way the judge had looked at Ethan before speaking told them that they weren't in control of this one. Sergeant Tom Kane sat still, unmoved, unshaken. He had spent too many years waiting in places more dangerous than this, watching, reading people, knowing when things were about to shift. And right now, things were shifting. Judge Mathers took a deep breath before she spoke. I have reviewed the arguments, the evidence, and the behavior displayed in this courtroom. She glanced at Ethan, her expression unreadable. And I must say, Mr. Caldwell, you have made this ruling quite easy for me. Ethan's father, Richard Caldwell, a man used to being untouchable, leaned forward slightly. His presence had loomed over the entire case, the weight of his wealth pressing down on everyone in the room. The billionaire was here to ensure his son walked out unscathed. But even he didn't look so sure anymore. Judge Mathers folded her hands on the bench. It is clear to me that the defendant, Mr. Ethan Caldwell, acted with reckless disregard for the safety of others when he struck Sergeant Kane with his vehicle. More than that, it is also evident that he showed no remorse for his actions, even after injuring a man who has given more to his country than Mr. Caldwell has given to anything in his life. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Ethan's face darkened. His fingers curled into fists, his knuckles white. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath. But the judge heard it. Her gaze snapped to him. "Is something amusing, Mr. Caldwell?" Ethan hesitated. His throat bobbed. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Judge Mathers continued. "I find that Sergeant Kane's injuries were not only preventable, but were the direct result of your arrogance and lack of accountability." Ethan's lawyers sat stiffly, the realization creeping in that they were about to lose. Judge Mathers picked up a sheet of paper from her desk, reading the verdict. The court orders the following. First, Mr. Ethan Caldwell will pay full restitution for Sergeant Kane's medical expenses, loss of work, and pain and suffering. Richard Caldwell exhaled, shaking his head slightly as if the number would be meaningless to him, just another problem money could fix. But then the judge kept reading. Furthermore, due to Mr. Caldwell's gross lack of empathy, his repeated disrespect toward a decorated war veteran, and his blatant disregard for the law, he is hereby sentenced to 1,000 hours of community service. Ethan's head snapped up. "What?" The judge didn't blink. "You will fulfill your hours at the Veterans Rehabilitation Center, where you will work directly with the men and women who have served this country. You will assist them with physical therapy, mobility exercises, and daily tasks as needed." Ethan's face twisted in outrage. "You can't be serious!" Judge Mathers' voice didn't waver. "Oh, I assure you I am." Laughter broke out from the gallery, a low chuckle here, a suppressed snort there. Even some of the reporters whispered furiously into their phones, their fingers flying across keyboards, capturing the moment. Ethan looked at his lawyers in panic. "Do something!" Harris, the lead attorney, cleared his throat carefully before standing. "Your Honor, this sentence seems excessive. Surely a financial penalty would suffice." The judge cut him off with a single raised hand. "Mr. Caldwell has spent his entire life buying his way out of consequences. That ends today." She turned back to Ethan, her gaze steady. "This is not a punishment meant to break you. This is a punishment meant to teach you, and if you fail to meet these requirements, you will serve jail time for contempt of court." The words slammed into Ethan like a sledgehammer. Richard Caldwell stood now, his presence looming. "This is absurd," he said smoothly, his voice carrying that same unshakable billionaire arrogance that had won him so many battles before. "We will appeal." Judge Mathers leaned forward slightly. "You are free to do so. But keep in mind, Mr. Caldwell, appealing this verdict will mean risking a full criminal trial for reckless endangerment. And given your son's behavior in this courtroom, I highly doubt he'd walk away with just community service." Richard stilled, his jaw clenched. He knew a losing fight when he saw one. He turned to Ethan, his voice tight. "Shut up and take the sentence." Ethan's breath shuddered as he ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was supposed to walk out of here laughing. He was supposed to go home, pour himself a drink, and forget this ever happened. Instead, he was being sentenced to work with veterans. The same people he had mocked, the same people he had thought were beneath him. Tom watched him carefully, his face unreadable. For the first time since the trial began, Ethan felt small. Judge Mathers lifted her gavel. "This court is adjourned." The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the room, sealing Ethan's fate. The reporters in the back scrambled to leave first, eager to be the first to publish the story. The gallery erupted into hushed conversation. Tom stood slowly, his legs still stiff from the injury Ethan had caused. But there was no anger on his face, no satisfaction, just a quiet kind of understanding. Rachel stepped up beside him, watching as Ethan sat frozen, his expression caught between disbelief and fury. "Guess he's finally learning what consequences look like." Tom let out a slow breath. "Not yet." Rachel raised a brow. "Not yet?" Tom picked up his cane, adjusting his stance before turning toward the exit. "He hasn't started his sentence yet," Tom said. "That's when the real lesson begins." As he walked out of the courtroom, Ethan Caldwell finally understood some things he never had before. Money wasn't going to save him this time, and for the first time in his life, he had no way out. Ethan Caldwell stood frozen in his chair, his entire world crumbling in front of him. The gavel's final crack still echoed in his head, but it wasn't just the sound, it was the finality of it. Judge Mathers had sentenced him to 1,000 hours of community service at the Veterans Rehabilitation Center, a place he would have never set foot in under normal circumstances. He felt every eye in the courtroom on him. The reporters were already typing, the whispers of the gallery cutting into his pride like a dull blade. His father, Richard Caldwell, was seething, his jaw clenched so tight that Ethan could practically hear the grinding of his teeth. The billionaire had built his empire by controlling the game, by never losing. And yet, today, he had lost. Ethan's fingers dug into the edge of the table. "This is a joke, right?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. His lawyer Harris sighed, rubbing his temples. "Ethan, don't make this worse than it already is." Ethan snapped his head toward him, rage burning behind his eyes. "Worse? I'm being sent to work with crippled veterans for months. How the hell am I supposed to just..." His father's voice cut through the air like a razor. "Enough." Ethan turned, staring at his father. There was no anger in Richard Caldwell's face, no sympathy, just cold disappointment. Ethan's stomach twisted. "Dad..." Richard didn't let him finish. He placed a hand on his son's shoulder, leaning in, his voice low enough that only Ethan could hear. "You made this mess," he murmured. "Now you're going to clean it up." Ethan felt the ice in those words. His father wasn't going to bail him out. There wouldn't be a wire transfer, a backroom deal, a favor to call in. He had been sentenced. And now, for the first time in his life, he had to deal with the consequences. The first morning of community service was a wake-up call unlike any Ethan had ever known. He pulled up to the Veterans Rehabilitation Center in his sleek black sports car, expecting some rundown government building. Instead, he was met with a quiet, sturdy facility, a place that looked more like a home than a hospital. But that didn't change how he felt about being there. He parked at the edge of the lot, shoving his sunglasses onto his face before stepping out. His designer jacket felt out of place here, and for the first time, he felt exposed. A man was waiting for him just outside the entrance. Sergeant Tom Kane. The veteran stood with his arms crossed, his stance steady, like he was waiting for something. Ethan scoffed as he walked up. "Great, the old man's my babysitter now?" Tom didn't smile, didn't blink, just watched him. "You're late." Ethan rolled his eyes. "I didn't realize this was the military, thought it was just charity work." Tom stepped forward, his voice calm, steady. "You're gonna learn real fast that the people in this building aren't your charity cases." Ethan snorted, shaking his head. "Whatever, let's just get this over with." Tom held the door open, nodding toward the entrance. "Then get inside." Ethan strutted through, but as soon as he stepped inside, the smell of antiseptic, coffee, and old leather filled his nose. The air felt different in here, heavier. And then he saw them. The veterans, men and women sitting in wheelchairs, some missing limbs, others with scars that ran deeper than skin. Some were laughing, some were playing cards, but they all carried a weight in their eyes that Ethan couldn't understand. And worse, they all looked at him like they already knew exactly who he was. A few murmured to each other. A man sitting in the corner, a former Marine judging by the tattoos on his arms, let out a low chuckle and shook his head. Ethan felt it immediately. He didn't belong here. Tom gestured toward a supply cart. "You're on cleanup duty today. Start with the floors." Ethan snapped his head toward him. "You want me to mop?" Tom raised an eyebrow. "Something wrong?" Ethan scoffed. "Yeah, something's wrong. I shouldn't even be here. This is insane." Tom stepped closer, his voice dropping just enough that only Ethan could hear. "You think this is hard?" he murmured. "You think pushing a mop around is some kind of punishment?" Ethan clenched his jaw. Tom leaned in just a little more. "Try learning how to walk again." Ethan's stomach turned. Tom straightened, nodding toward the supply cart. "Get moving." Ethan hesitated for half a second longer, then grabbed the mop with an irritated grunt. And as he did, the entire room was watching, not saying a word, just watching. Tom walked away, leaving Ethan alone with his task. Ethan gritted his teeth, gripping the mop handle tighter. This was humiliating. These people were beneath him, and yet, somehow, he was the one being judged. As he began moving the mop across the floor, he heard one of the veterans chuckle under his breath. Maybe there's hope for this one after all. Ethan pretended not to hear it, but deep down, he already knew something was changing, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't the one calling the shots. Ethan Caldwell had never felt so small in his life. His hands gripped the mop handle, his fingers aching from the tight grip. He wasn't used to work like this. He had never cleaned anything in his life. Not his room, not a car, nothing. Someone had always done it for him. But there was no escape here. The veteran's eyes followed him as he moved across the floor. They didn't say much, but their presence was heavy. Some of them had seen more than Ethan could ever imagine. Some of them were missing limbs, walking on prosthetics, or sitting in wheelchairs, watching the world from a different perspective. And here he was, mopping a floor, thinking he had it bad. A rough voice cut through the silence. "You missed a spot." Ethan's jaw clenched. He turned, scowling, and found himself staring at an older man in a wheelchair. His hair was silver but thick, his arms still muscular despite the years. His sharp eyes filled with something Ethan didn't quite understand yet. The name tag on his chest read, "Reed." Ethan let out a slow breath, rolling his eyes as he ran the mop back over the same section. "There. Happy now?" Reed chuckled. "I don't know. Might need another pass." The men around him chuckled, and Ethan felt his ears burn. He wasn't used to being laughed at. Another veteran sitting nearby, a younger guy with a prosthetic leg, leaned forward in his chair. "You must be that rich kid." Ethan didn't respond. He focused on the mop, moving it across the tiles with just a little more force than necessary. Reed wasn't done. "What's wrong, moneybags? No maids here to do the dirty work?" Ethan tightened his grip. "You think this is funny?" Reed's smirk didn't fade. A little. The room rumbled with quiet laughter, but there was no malice in it, no hatred. It was just the way soldiers talked. Ethan exhaled sharply, forcing himself to focus on the floor. The rhythm of the mop moving back and forth was strangely calming, mind-numbing. Then a different voice, softer but firm, spoke. "You ever break a bone, kid?" Ethan turned and saw Tom Kane standing near the doorway, watching him. Ethan snorted. "No." Tom nodded slowly. "Ever have to learn how to walk again?" Ethan stopped moving. The words hit him in the chest like a sledgehammer. Tom stepped forward, his limp noticeable but not slowing him down. "There are men in this room who had to learn how to hold a spoon again, how to stand, how to run, how to live in a world that doesn't care that they bled for it." He tilted his head slightly. "And you're upset about a mop." Ethan swallowed hard. The silence in the room stretched. For the first time since he had stepped into this place, he really looked at the people around him. They weren't laughing at him. They were waiting for him to get it. Something in Ethan's chest tightened, a foreign feeling creeping in. The weight of something he had never truly felt before. Shame. Not because of the mop, because for the first time, he realized what these men had been through and how little he had ever truly suffered. Ethan lowered his gaze, taking a slow breath. He ran the mop over the floor again, this time without sarcasm, without anger. Reed watched him, nodding slightly. Not bad. The laughter was softer this time, less mocking. Tom sat down across from Reed, picking up a cup of coffee. His voice was quieter now, not as sharp, but still firm. "You've got 1,000 hours ahead of you, kid. Maybe you'll learn something before it's over." Ethan didn't reply, because for the first time in his life, he was listening. The weeks passed slowly, then all at once. At first, Ethan hated every second. The cleaning, the labor, the way the veterans would give him hell for every little thing. But over time, something shifted. He started learning names. Reed had been in the Marines, deployed more times than he could count. He had lost his legs to an IED, but he still rolled around the center like he owned the place, cracking jokes and calling people out on their bullshit. Danny, the younger vet, had been a combat medic. His prosthetic didn't slow him down one bit, and he liked to remind Ethan that if he ever got a paper cut, he wouldn't be saving him. Slowly, without even realizing it, Ethan stopped feeling like an outsider. The work never got easier. His body ached from tasks he wasn't used to. His hands blistered from lifting equipment, scrubbing floors, helping with exercises. But he stopped complaining. One afternoon, he was helping one of the older men adjust his wheelchair, tightening a bolt that had come loose. Reed watched him, sipping his coffee. "You do good work, moneybags." Ethan scoffed. Yeah. Reed's expression turned serious for a moment. "No, really. You came in here thinking this was beneath you. Now you're actually helping." Ethan didn't know how to respond to that, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't doing something for himself. He was doing it because it needed to be done. The last day of his community service came faster than Ethan expected. He walked into the center like he always did now, without hesitation, without arrogance. Reed smirked as Ethan entered. "Today's the day, huh?" Ethan shrugged. "Guess so." Danny tossed a towel at him. "Don't think this means we'll miss you." Ethan caught the towel, shaking his head with a smirk. "I won't hold my breath." Tom stood near the entrance, watching the exchange. When Ethan finally walked up to him, something unspoken passed between them. Ethan cleared his throat. "So, I guess this is it." Tom studied him for a moment. "That depends." Ethan frowned. "On what?" Tom took a sip of coffee. "On whether or not you walk out that door and forget everything you learned in here." Ethan swallowed hard. For a long time, he would have. But now he wasn't so sure. Reed called out from across the room. "Hey, rich boy, you gonna come visit, or you just gonna pretend this never happened?" Ethan let out a small laugh. "You think I'd come back?" Reed grinned. "I think you already know the answer." Ethan looked around the room, at the people he had met, the people who had changed him in ways he never expected. Then he nodded, a real, genuine nod. "Yeah," he said. "I'll be back." Tom watched him go, a knowing look in his eyes, because this wasn't just the end of a sentence. It was the beginning of something else, something better, the end.